Welcome to Divorced from Reality with Johnny Bardine.
Hello and welcome to Divorced from Reality with Johnny Bardine. Johnny has a mission to help Tampa Bay individuals and families through the most challenging times of their lives, doing so with compassion, fierce advocacy, and efficiency. And it's something that he does every day. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today's episode is going to be about contested versus amicable divorces. Johnny, great to see you.
Hey, Kevin, good to see you again.
All right, so we're going to talk about contested versus amicable. I'm sure it probably skews one way as a general rule.
Look, as I said in the first episode, there's no such thing as a typical divorce. So they go in a bunch of different ways. And the law, what's frustrating sometimes as a practitioner is that the law is fairly simple, it's fairly written, it's easy to understand, but the people make it really difficult, and the people's emotions make it very difficult.
Sure.
So some cases end up pretty amicable after a very contentious start, sometimes vice versa. You just got to be ready for it and do the things that are going to help you prepare for however that case goes.
So what does the term high conflict divorce mean in Florida?
Hey, look, what that means, generally speaking, is that the two people are just involved, the two parties are just dislike each other and can't settle on any issue, even as to the color of the sky.
Yeah,
I mean,
they don't want to just give in at all.
You're
Right.
Everyone gets entrenched in the decision, and the more sometimes that you try to explain to someone why they should change their position, the more entrenched they become in that. As I mentioned, we go to mediation pretty early on in the process, and then after that, then the court might decide. And so in those high conflict cases, it's the ones where you've got a mediation, reached an impasse, and now you're on a collision course for the judge to decide the case.
What are some of the, primary signs that indicate a divorce is moving into that high conflict territory?
I think if you've proposed something that is very vanilla and that you've proposed in similar cases for a decade and a half, and then it's just met either with abject anger or stonewalled entrenchment, then I think that's a good sign that you might be into a contentious place. Also, if there's at the start, you get the sense that one of the parents thinks of themselves as the alpha parent and the other parent has to do whatever they say, or that they should be default the primary parent, that's a good sign that that's going to be a hard cliff to claw back from.
Yeah, that's a good one for sure.
Yeah.
When it comes to an amicable divorce, I think we hear that term and we think, oh, everything just worked out all, nice and friendly and all that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that both parties agree on everything, right?
Well, there are a couple ways to think about that. In Florida, there's a process called Simplified dissolution of marriage, and those are for the hyper amicable divorces. So in those cases, there cannot be minor children in between the parties, and both parties need to sign a jointly stipulated petition and appear together at the final hearing. And in those cases, they're often short-term marriages with any assets or liabilities really to divide and no minor children. So that's the most amicable one. The second type are people who just don't have a lot of money for litigation, and they've got a couple well-adjusted children who love both their parents, and they've got some fairly simple equitable distribution issues, a house to divide up or a retirement account or two to split up. And so in those cases, you can often get it resolved at mediation because it's too expensive to fight further when I think the outcome is fairly predictable.
We've talked about how divorces can start contentious and become more amicable as people get more comfortable with the situation. Do you ever see it go the other way, where it starts out amicable and then all of a sudden people start fighting as it goes on?
It often is when prior to the separation, one of the parties wasn't completely honest with the other one about something. Like if something is discovered that they didn't know about during the course of the divorce, then that can shift it from something amicable to something that's quite contentious.
How does that affect the process when that happens?
Makes it longer and makes it more expensive. So I tell my clients, I'm like, look, the only people who really win from these contentious and litigious divorces are the attorneys, because the court is pretty bound in a box by the statute about what their possible outcomes can be. And in mediation, that's your time to be creative about a solution that works for you. Mm-hmm. So if you can't do either one of those, then the only thing you're doing is spending more money on attorneys and making this a harder process on your children if you have children, and a harder process on you and your pocketbook.
How much involvement do you have if in an uncontested or amicable divorce?
I've got some involvement. So in an uncontested divorce or a simplified dissolution, of which I do many of those, I will draw up that jointly stipulated stipulated petition and coordinate with the other party. I can only represent one of the parties. So even though it's not non-contested. And so I'll coordinate with the other party to get them to do the administrative and clerical things they need to do to get it done. And then I will schedule and appear with my client at the final hearing, which is usually conducted by Zoom. Yeah, it is pretty painless because you avoid the duty to file a financial affidavit and do that financial disclosure, which can be an onerous and tedious process. And in terms of time, I mean, you can file the petition and get divorced within the month if you do it right, which is not the case for contested divorce.
Sure. Yeah. So that month, that's fast. That's real fast. When children are involved, can an amicable divorce still result in custody issues, child support issues? I mean, is that a big sticking point?
Oftentimes you get to terms on the financial stuff, and what's remaining is the child care and the time sharing parts of it. So yeah, that's often that's because people can understand dispassionately splitting up their 401k, but it's really hard to understand dispassionately having equal time sharing when you think you're entitled, when you think you're the better parent. Telling someone that I think the court is likely to conclude they'll be entitled to equal time sharing is sometimes difficult for people to understand.
Yeah, and there's the emotional attachment to that too. Yeah. I mean, I have a child, I have a 4-year-old, and we joke all the time, like, I wouldn't mind a week off from him every other week, but
right.
But the truth of the matter is, when you're used to spending every day with your child, like, that's a tough thing to realize that you're going to be just separated for a certain amount of time.
Right.
What steps do you feel that parents should take to make sure they always keep their child's best interest prioritized, even if it's a amicable divorce?
It's starting to sound like a broken record here, but you need to look at some help outside of the legal system.
Yeah.
For your help here. So making sure that there's a community around your child where they're well-adjusted at school and have friends and are involved in extracurricular activities so that their life doesn't become this divorce. And for the litigants to do the same thing, to engage in therapy and make sure they've got a social network and they're doing some other things so that their personality isn't just going through a divorce. And keeping those things in your mind and moving through this case with a sense that, look, we got to get through this so we don't screw up these kids for the long term, I think is really important.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good way to put it too. It's not your personality. It's just something you're going through, but it doesn't have to be your whole life.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's important for sure. That's really good advice. So if couples have significant assets or maybe really complicated financial situations, can an uncontested divorce still work, or is that tougher?
It's tougher. It can work. But remember that in a simplified dissolution, you're no longer having the requirement to do the mandatory disclosure and do the financial disclosure that you would in normal cases. So I wouldn't advise to do the simplified route because there's just too much to account for and too much that you have to know that the other party knows about you. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a higher ability to secret your assets or do some other things to avoid disclosure in the simplified dissolution. So in cases with high net worth people or high asset people, I would not recommend doing a simplified dissolution.
Okay. And going back to some of the high conflict divorces in Florida, can mediation help resolve issues even when both parties are just in significant disagreement, or do you find that it ends up being somewhat fruitless?
I guess I have three things to say on that. Number one, it's going to be unavoidable. Mediation is required. I've definitely had cases where we've shut up a mediation, walk right back out just to check the box so we can move on with litigation. I don't recommend that. That's not my preference. And then secondly, look, it's important to know that's often the first time in the case in which people are focused on it solely and are now able to sit down and think about the problem only. And so it's often everyone's first opportunity to really know or try to understand what the other person's thinking. So if you settle it at the mediation, that's great. But at a minimum, you should be leaving that with a better understanding of what everyone's relative position is going to be. And the third thing is cost. These get really expensive, and they get very expensive after the mediation. And so having that in your mind when you're at the mediation table and looking forward to whatever your possible cost exposure might be is sometimes inspiring to get to an agreement or close to one at the mediation.
I would imagine if you have high contested, or high conflict divorces,
right,
I would imagine that if kids are involved, that can be quite the sticking point where, disputes over custody, disputes over time sharing, not being willing to share that part of it. When does Florida's court system really step in, and how do they handle these type of disagreements, especially if there's just really no desire to compromise?
Well, I want to go back to something I said earlier, which was the change in the statute that now has a presumption of equal time sharing. What I thought when that law first passed was that it would dial down some of the contention in these cases because they could see that they're going to get equal time sharing at the end. But my experience is that the opposite's been true, that people are having more fights over time sharing, and that people get further entrenched in their position, even though the law has changed to say this stuff probably won't matter and you're going to get equal time sharing.
Okay.
So I think that's been difficult. And so the courts try to impress upon the parties that change in the law. But people get very stubborn in these situations and hear only what they want to hear. So after the mediation, often we engage in some more discovery. I might take one of the parties' depot or ask for some more documents to be provided. But then generally I get pointed towards finality. So I'll set a case management conference with the court, and I'll get some pretrial and trial dates, and I'll have a date certain on the calendar for people to resolve this case. Because often I find that people don't do anything unless they have to do it. So if you get something on the calendar that people can either look forward to or be afraid of, I think that can often inspire resolution.
Look forward to or be afraid of. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's a good way to put it. I mean, in your experience, is it difficult once someone in a high conflict divorce to sort of, I don't know, just like get someone to just focus and understand the law and understand that they might not get everything that they want?
All clients are different. And client management is, I think, one of the big challenges that we have. And so sometimes there needs to be a part of my practice that is very educational. And so I would talk to them about it. And I don't mind telling a client when they're holding an unreasonable position or one that I think is legally untenable. But it's difficult sometimes to get, sometimes you have to have the come to Jesus meetings with the clients. And sometimes it's hard to get them to get an understanding of that. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's very easy. So all clients are different. And I treat my cases that way too, very individually.
Obviously, people watch TV and movies and talk to friends, and they have these sort of preconceived notions about what a divorce process looks like. We touched on last episode about how, there was that old mom gets the kids sort of thing. Are there any other misconceptions that you find people come to you with based on the fact that they have heard it elsewhere and think they know what they're doing? Yeah.
I hear all kinds of crazy stuff. People watch too many episodes of Suits, or someone at work said something about their divorce that they've misconstrued. So we hear a lot of stuff. The one thing I hear a lot of is that there's such a thing as abandonment of a marriage. Like if you've moved out of the house or separated from your spouse, that's somehow going to penalize you because you've abandoned the marriage or you abandoned the children, even though you just moved to the other part of town. And that's just not true. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to move out of the house and be separated from your spouse before a divorce occurs. And then after the divorce, you guys are going to be separate people. So you cannot be penalized from moving from the marital home, precipitating the divorce. There is a term in Florida called abandonment, and it's in Chapter 39 of the Florida statutes, and it doesn't mean this. So it means something else entirely. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. Like what you guys need to do is early on in the process, figure out an exit strategy to get out of that house and do what's best for you and your children as you prepare for what could be a very long process of a divorce.
When you mentioned that if it's completely amicable, it can take as little as a month to complete the process. What is the average time for, like maybe not necessarily a high conflict, not necessarily completely amicable, but somewhere right in the middle? Is there kind of an average?
Yeah, about a year.
Okay.
About a year. Yeah. From if we were to start the divorce today and have a judge decide it at a trial, it'd be about a year. And I think and a lot of that has to do with court and lawyer calendaring and scheduling. Not like you're fighting the whole time. But yeah, I think a contested divorce can expect that to be about a year and get to mediation in the first 3 or 4 months. Okay. So first 3 or 4 months you get to mediation, and that's your chance to really, like, as you said, learn what the other party wants. And then after that you go through the process of finalizing the divorce. Correct. Right.
And litigation is not always necessary though, right?
No, even after the mediation, you can still, I do this all the time, you can still settle the case and communicate with the other lawyer about settlement procedures all the way up until trial. Like I said, sometimes having the trial in the calendar can inspire some settlement. I've got a couple cases right now that are set for trial, which has really kicked up the settlement discussions. So mediation is not anywhere close to your last opportunity to settle a case. It's often the first one.
Okay. And if you're able to settle in mediation, does that change that timeline dramatically?
Yeah, if you settle it in mediation, you leave that mediation with usually a marital settlement agreement. And then it's just a matter of calling the court and setting the final hearing, which is just going to take 5 minutes, and they're just going to stamp the agreement and you'll be on your way.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you can make that work, do it.
Please. I don't mind the conflict. That's the life I've chosen for myself, but there's no reason why you should choose it for yourself if you're going through this.
Yeah.
It's not going to be better because it was harder.
Yeah. Well, again, you have a lot of good advice, and it's not going to be better just because it's harder. That's a good way to look at it. All right. Well, thank you for tuning in to Divorced from Reality with Johnny Bardine. To connect with Johnny, head to BardineLawFirm.com, and please like, subscribe, and review our channel. We love having you be part of our community. Johnny, great to see you again. Thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.